Oh, come, let us adore him. In the name of God, amen. In the fall of 1998, I was managing a team in a public relations firm. And one of our clients was a well-known bookseller, one of the big two, then selling books in superstores across America. My client that October had launched a website of its own to protect its market share and stock price from Amazon.com, then a mere toddler of 4. So after the big launch event in New York, my team settled in for days of phoning business press reporters. Our pitch was simple, and we thought compelling. This coming Christmas season was to be the first where sizable numbers of consumers would be buying gifts online. Our client would be happy to talk to you about this. I myself was working from a short list my client deemed crucial: Fortune, Forbes, The Wall Street Journal, The Economist. These reporters were hard to reach and tended to be skeptical of people like me. So my heart leapt one Advent morning when I phoned London, and a technology reporter from The Economist actually picked up his phone. I told him who I was representing, and he seemed interested. I told him that this Christmas season was to be unlike any other because consumers were beginning to move away from what we were disparagingly calling brick and mortar retail. This Christmas, I remember telling him earnestly, it's all about online retail. Oh, he said, after letting my pitch hang for an excruciating moment of midair instability. Oh, I thought this Christmas was all about the baby Jesus. I can't even tell you tonight what happened next, what I said next, or whether he eventually covered us or not, because his rejoinder knocked me over, embarrassed me into a kind of simper. I was then in my early 30s. I was in the process of excavating my own Christian faith, a faith I'd abandoned almost as soon as I'd been confirmed 20 years previously. I was intensely curious about the avowed Christians I was meeting in other Episcopal churches in the Boston area, and I was anxious at the same time not to be mistaken for any one of them. The virgin birth, the resurrection, what could these possibly have to do with me? I thought this Christmas was all about the baby Jesus. Well, of course it is. But what does this baby have to do with us? Why a baby and why us? These were the questions that were then a private struggle for me. You know, there is the faith that you receive as a child, and no small number of us need to smash that vessel and then reassemble it for ourselves. I remember taking a trip to Rome at about this time in my life, visiting the grand Roman Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore. There, under the altar in a sort of marble grotto, is enshrined wood, said to be the remains of the actual manger. I knelt down, as one tends to do in such places, but the cynic in me stared at that wood, thought of all the pieces of wood and bone and cloth that once circulated across Europe and the Near East. The cynic in me recalled a statement credited to the 16th century Dutch humanist, Erasmus, a bit of a wag, who suggested that if all of the fragments of the true cross were to be collected, we would have enough wood to build Noah's Ark. So why a baby? And why us? The doubts and the questioning, if I'd been more deeply honest with myself, were not simply the products of a defensive and insecure intellect. It was rather the result of the most anguished and frightened question in the world on this holy night and every night. It's the higher power question. If that higher power loves us and seeks us, has come to share in our humanity and redeem it, how do we explain, for example, Herod and the Herods who reign in every age? Or systemic racism, or violence, or untimely death that is as close, even on this night, as tomorrow morning's headlines? Why a baby? Why us? And what's he up to now, if things are such a mess? By way of suggesting a response, I invite you to pause for a moment on this holy night, to pause and to think about what you know about newborn babies. Maybe you have seen a baby born. Maybe you have given birth to a baby yourself. But if you haven't, at least you know what a newborn is like. They are wrinkly. Their eyes are shut against the bright light. Tiny fingers no bigger than pipe cleaners, curled and clasped. Lungs no bigger than twinned strawberries. Lungs for months full of fluid, and now just after birth, the sharp cold air is rushing in and they are gasping for their very lives. If you've ever held a baby, you know you have to support their necks. The little plates that comprise their skulls have not yet knit together, so it's both firm and soft, continent and open sea, frighteningly tender and exposed. All of us have lived through that, even if we don't remember it. Birth, one of the greatest traumas we have ever endured. Who would ever volunteer to do that? What kind of a higher power could this possibly be? Such a strange and surprising God. You know, I have yet to see the nativity scene that captures what had to have been the reality of that long ago night. The babies in these arrangements tend to look strong and serene, 25 pounds over average birth weight. Old enough maybe to form words. Some of them look old enough to toddle off and make themselves a piece of toast if they're hungry. And maybe something deep down inside of us prefers our gods that way. Strong, capable, beautiful, serene, white. If you remember your Greek mythology, you'll remember that Athena, for example, sprang fully formed from the forehead of Zeus, mature, armored, and armed. This baby is something else altogether. Not a higher power, but a higher vulnerability. Not a higher power, but a higher vulnerability. And this God above all gods, this fragile, curled, gasping God, will ask us to love him. To love and care for his flesh, and to love and care for all flesh. So what better way to get our attention? These bands of cloth, swaddling clothes, the first act of love and care he will experience. Later he will be baptized, he will be anointed by people who love him with costly ointment. People will have to take him in, Martha, Mary, Lazarus, because he will seem to be homeless, without money or power in the usual sense. His lifeless body will finally be wrapped again in cloth. It's all about the baby tonight. So why baby? And why us? What child is this? What kind of God could this be? What kind of God can't hold up its own neck? What kind of a God wets itself, spits up? What kind of a God comes to us not armored or armed, but gasping for air, as each one of us did when we were born ourselves? Here, perhaps, is the kind of God this is. This is a God, under all of the mythologizing beyond every Christmas carol, laid in a manger that may have been wood or may have been stone. This is a God who needs you. A God who needs you. A God who knows that our world is full of fragile and hurting and gasping people. And this God comes to share all of it and to remind us that it is up to us, each one of us, to do the swaddling, to do the supporting. This is a God whose very vulnerability will serve to remind each one of us, how much love and power we bear, but so often locked up inside of us. A God who comes here as a tiny baby comes to draw us out and unlock us. The infant's neediness, its very fragility, will inspire us to lean in, to open up, to be changed. And this is a God who believes we are up for, capable of this very change. It's all about the baby and you and me. You know, the late British priest Michael Maine was on pretty intimate terms with the baby Jesus. Once the Dean of Westminster and a BBC commentator, Michael Maine had enjoyed a fairly illustrious career in England as an elite and rather fancy priest. Later in life, he developed an aggressive cancer in his jaw that would eventually take him. Recalling after his diagnosis all of the hospital visits he had made in his career, all of the praying he had done as the well person with those gravely ill, he said that suddenly all of those words he had shared were, quote, becoming flesh for him. To speak of God as all-powerful is confusing, he wrote during his treatment. If that conveys a sense of one whose nature is so volatile that he creates floods and earthquakes and tumors because he is angry or displeased with us, this homeless refugee infant, as well as this Christ who will, as an adult, be put to death, was rather, for Michael Maine, a symbol of dislocation and shared vulnerability, cosmically shared vulnerability, not a higher power, a higher vulnerability. It's all about the baby. And in an act of divine self-limitation, concluded Maine, this is a God who relinquishes control over creation, allowing creation and its creatures to be self-creative as we seek for beauty and goodness and truth, as we struggle to learn the meaning of our relationship with nature the power of forgiveness, the language of love. It's all about the baby. What could be more ordinary and extraordinary all at once than a newborn? Now, a sunset or a mountain vista or a walk along First Encounter Beach at dawn may hint to us of God's power and glory. But those aren't things we can model ourselves on, can we? We can't copy any of the above. It's all about the baby. And the big idea of this holy night is that it takes something as fragile and as commonplace as a defenseless child to unlock, to release us, no matter our age, from our exhausting need to win, to possess, to manipulate, to be the center of attention. God knows we have been built for better and for more. Herod reigns. Herod reigns, wrote the Russian poet Joseph Brodsky in his poem December 24th, 1971. Brodsky was then living in internal exile in Soviet Russia. Herod reigns, says the poet. Herod reigns, but the stronger he is, the more sure, the more certain, the wonder, and the constancy of this relationship is the basic mechanics of Christmas. The basic mechanics of Christmas. Perhaps these mechanics, which Brodsky identified more than 50 years ago, were made clear to you this past week. On display so dramatically in Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's address to Congress. Talk about vulnerability. Talk about the leadership of the fragile and endangered. On display in a manner which caused most of our nation's elected representatives in both parties to remember, to reclaim, to unlock the best in themselves. Compassion. Compassion. To suffer with. That's what makes us human. The captivating and inspiring thing about the Ukrainian president is a kind of authenticity and vulnerability. The mayhem and tenderness of this midnight birth, this fragile, curled, clasping visitor from the heart of God, comes again to restore us to our truest selves. It's all about the baby. So on this holy night, may this higher vulnerability, wrapped in swaddling clothes, remind you of your own great power to love, to care, and to make this exhausted and weary world new. It's all about the baby. So lean in and see, and be changed by what you see. Oh, come, let us adore him.